Moebius, Druillet, and Alex Niño. This visionary Filipino genius is one of the greatest comic book artists of all time. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Comics Rot Your Brain, the show where screenwriters talk about the comic books that we love, especially from the 1980s. I'm your host, Steven Bagatourian, and my usual co-host, Chris Derrick, is off on assignment, creating something beautiful for the world, artistically speaking, and he will be back shortly. But in the meantime, today we are going to be talking about a comic book called Space Clusters, a graphic novel, to be exact, written by Arthur Byron Cover, illustrated with incomparable aplomb and visionary panache by Mr. Alex Niño, and published by DC Comics. Alrighty, so now, as I said here at the outset, Alex Niño is an artist who really should need no introduction. In my opinion, and the opinion of many others, he's easily one of the greatest comic book artists of all time. So, why is it, we got to ask ourselves, why is it that probably many of you listening to this recording have likely never even heard of him? Now, the answer to that question is complex. Alex Niño's work, I think, is clearly the equal of people like Moebius, Druillet, Breccia, Frazetta, so many artists that are rightfully praised to the high heavens. And for whatever combination of political reasons, God knows what other reasons, Alex Niño, who is still alive and still drawing unbelievable work today, for whatever reasons, he is just not as well known as he ought to be. And I feel truly that when it comes to stylized, immersive world building, character design, fluid yet also jagged, ornate line work, this is a guy who is absolutely without rival. His work is virtuosic and utterly individual. So why is he so criminally unheralded? Stick around to the end of the video. Hopefully we'll be able to get to the bottom of this. Appreciate the support from everybody. Please remember to like and subscribe. It's free. It costs you nothing, but it helps us a lot with the show. And if you're like really wanting to help and you got a couple of extra shekels, then please also check out our Patreon, Comics Rot Your Brain on Patreon, where we have some great free content, not free, I shouldn't say free, bonus content for anyone who supports the show for a meager couple of bucks a month. You get some great bonus episodes, and we've got some very exciting things coming up later this year that are going to be Patreon exclusive. Here at my side, what I hope will be very helpful, and I believe it will be, is a copy of Comic Book Artist Magazine, number 4, published 20 years ago by Top Shelf Productions and Mr. John Cook. It is a terrific compendium of information about all of the Filipino artists who broke into comics in the 70s and 80s, with a special focus on Alex Niño. And I'm going to be drawing heavily upon this volume for research and the work done by Mr. Cook and some of his other companions and research mates at the magazine, including the incredible UK artist and art historian David Roach, who is also a terrific follow on Facebook these days. Just a unbelievable treasure house of knowledge when it comes to comic book art. And they've got some incredible articles here that we can look at for some context before we talk about this DC graphic novel from the 80s that Alex Niño so beautifully illustrated, and which you are seeing the fruits of scrolling by in this video right now. And we're going to get to that. And that graphic novel was actually number 7 in a series of European-style graphic albums that DC released in the mid-80s. And it was an initiative that they were apparently high on for a moment, and then they abandoned. But that initiative included some very interesting volleys in that format, including Kevin O'Neill and Pat Mills of Nemesis the Warlock fame, and as well as League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. They did a book called Metal Zoic for that line, and also Ernie Colon did the Medusa chain, and then of course Mr. Jack Kirby did his final volume in the story of the Fourth World and the New Gods. And of course, Jack Kirby did the Hunger Dogs, speaking of visionary artists, and that was Kirby getting a chance to kind of wrap up the Fourth World New God saga, but not exactly the way he'd intended, but perhaps better late than never. But anyways, that was all this part of this line here, of which Space Clusters was the final volume. So yeah, now I want to give everyone just a little context when we talk about the Filipino artists who came and drew comics for DC and Marvel in the 70s and 80s. I think some context is essential. So I'm going to quote here from one of the articles from John Cook in this issue of Comic Book Artist, where he talks really quite emotionally about his experiences with these artists. And I think it'll give some great context. So he says, anyone even slightly familiar with comic book artists realizes that ye editor, my humble self, is a sequential art freak, particularly obsessed with the American comic books of the 1970s in whatever form they took in that day. From DC's daring and different titles under Carmine Infantino's helmsmanship, to the faux comics of National Lampoon, to the mind-blowing underground efforts coming from San Francisco, ye ed is convinced that the story behind that era's funny books is an important tale worth telling. One severely underappreciated aspect of U.S. comics in the 70s is surely the arrival and accomplishments of the Philippine School of Artists, a stunningly talented group of men who made an immediate and lasting impression on the industry and among appreciative readers. Strange-sounding names, De Zuniga, Niño, Redondo, Alcala, etc., would quickly become familiar and quite welcome to those aficionados willing to venture outside the superhero genre and take a peek at the mystery, Western, science fiction, romance, and war anthologies of those years. Nestor was knocking him dead in Swamp Thing. Alex was blowing our minds over at Warren. Alfredo was astounding us with his inks on John Buscema's Savage Sword of Conan. The Filipinos were everywhere in the 70s. While the comics of that decade have been examined ad nauseum by this magazine and others, as well as in a number of bona fide books on the subject, extremely little has been written anywhere about this so-called invasion, quote unquote, of the Filipinos. Keep in mind, this article is 20 years old, but I don't know really that that much has been written really even since then, because honestly, through some cursory internet searching before recording this episode, it was shockingly hard to find interviews and even comprehensive articles on the work of Alex Niño in particular. There are a few places, like I say, this particular issue of Comic Book Artist, and I should also give a special shout out to some of the YouTube videos that I looked at that regarded Alex Niño, one of which in particular I found especially helpful in its incisive commentary and its incredible passion coming from the wonderful host. This was on the show Blurted Out, hosted by Adrian Johnson, and he has a YouTube channel called Inazuma Studios, which is spelled Inazuma Studios. And Adrian's got a terrific video on Alex Niño on YouTube right now, where he goes through his own personal collection of Alex Niño work, and it's fascinating and inspiring. And Adrian's an extremely talented artist himself and has a really comprehensive and just wonderful take on Niño. So I'd highly recommend everyone check that out as well. We'll include a link to that video in our description for this episode. Okay, so having said that, back to this article where Cook goes on to say that there was such little work talking about the Filipinos, he felt the responsibility to do something here with his magazine. He says there was only a single issue of the fascinating Philippine Comics Review published in 1979, a sole entry on Alex Niño in a book called Comics Between the Panels that Mike Richardson and Steve Dwin put out in 1998. And there was a lone article in CBA by Chris Knowles in 99. And honestly, he says there was scant else to be found about the experiences of the 90 or so artists from the Southeast Asian archipelago who toiled in U.S. comics for upwards of 3 decades. So think about that, folks. That's around 100 artists coming from the Philippines, coming to America here in the 70s and 80s to draw for the biggest US publishers of comics, and to draw, frankly, in a style of art that was a throwback to such classicist and extraordinary artwork of the past that they really outshined a vast majority of the American artists at that time. So it's really confounding and kind of head scratching that these artists, these Filipino artists, are not better known and not talked about more. And the work is really, really amazing, and it speaks for itself. But even amongst that cohort, Alex Niño's work does stand out, and we're going to talk about why it stands out, because the other artists in that school, your Alfredo Alcalas, your Nestor Redondos, these guys were coming from a much more classicist approach that would be familiar to fans of like Alex Raymond, Flash Gordon, Prince Valiant. I mean, kind of that school of very traditional representational art that is breathtaking in its own way. But what Niño did was visionary, more in the school of a Moebius, a Druillet, like I say, even Frazetta in some aspects, just the kind of work that draws more and more, and also like Jack Kirby, frankly, and a lot of Kirby's wilder work when we're talking about space gods and, you know, the Fourth World Saga and things of that nature. We're talking about just work that is the product of an unbridled imagination exploding forth on the page. And interestingly, much like Jack Kirby, who never did psychedelic drugs to our knowledge, Alex Niño also has said that he did not partake of psychedelic drugs. But yet both men were asked that question repeatedly when people were looking at their work in the 70s in particular, and the 80s, because the work just felt like such an explosion of otherworldly, hallucinogenic, cosmic material that it was hard to imagine that these guys were getting there on the natch, so to speak. But apparently they were, and it makes it just all the more breathtaking what was going on in their minds and just what was kind of flowing out of them. And Niño talks quite fascinatingly about going into a bit of a trance state while he's drawing and just feeling like he leaves his body and is in another world, essentially, while he's drawing. And when you see the work, you can imagine exactly what he means. And, you know, sure, a lot of artists talk about that, but I think that this is something beyond just being in the typical flow state that, you know, the average comic artist or the average kind of like productivity sort of guru might tell you. I'm not talking about being in a flow state like somebody like Cal Newport might suggest. I think this is something beyond that. This is really just genuinely channeling some kind of God knows what from some other dimension, because when you see the work, it does not feel like it's even of human origin in some ways. And I mean that as a compliment. It's mind blowing. So anyway, back to what Mr. Cook is saying here. He goes on to say that, so we got around 100 Filipino artists, regardless of all their efforts pumping out thousands of pages, among them innumerable masterpieces, often for a pitiful page rate. These artists have received virtually no recognition from fandom and historians, never mind being forgotten and disrespected by an ungrateful industry. For shame. The question of why naturally comes to mind. Why have the Filipino artists been so ignored over the years? Is it blatant xenophobia against foreign artists, similar to the neglect that the Spanish and South American schools also suffer? Or is it a side effect of the prejudice against non-superhero material, as few Filipinos, among them Alcala, Rudy Nebres, and Danny Bulandi, were successful in the costume character field? Some major U.S. artists of that era have opined that the Philippine art was not of the standard or was hardly comparable to contemporary American efforts. Huh? Yeah, huh? Indeed. In this editor's humble opinion, as a group, these Asian artists were astonishingly accomplished and talented beyond measure. Certainly, the top 3 talents, Nestor Redondo, Alex Niño, and Alfredo Alcala, stand shoulder to shoulder with any comic book artist the world over, bowing their heads to no one. I'm going to repeat that sentence because it bears repeating. The top 3 talents, certainly Nestor Redondo, Alex Niño and Alfredo Alcala stand shoulder to shoulder with any comic book artist the world over, bowing their heads to no one. So this issue in particular is a labor of love, as I've been fascinated by the work of these illustrators. And again, this is John Cook at Comic Book Artist Magazine talking. I've been fascinated by the work of these illustrators ever since my oldest brother, Richie, in a dramatic gesture, held up a gorgeous Alex Niño comic book. This was back in the early 70s, and exclaimed, "This is as good as anything else being published today." Now, those were heady words, as Jack Kirby, Bernie Wrightson, Barry Windsor Smith, Neil Adams, Mike Kaluta, etc. were arguably producing the finest work in that time frame. So needless to say, I've been eager to devote an issue of this magazine to the Filipino School of Artists for a long, long time. Here's hoping that this woefully short section is but an opening volley in efforts to rectify these shortcomings. No doubt these gents are deserving of the attention. And so, so I say thank you to John Cook for this terrific research volume. I highly recommend everybody seek this out on eBay. Again, it's Comic Book Artist Magazine, issue number 4 from 2004, published by Top Shelf. And it has the most comprehensive listing of the work and the history of all these incredible Filipino artists that I've ever seen. And it's just wonderful. And so now I'm going to go to David Roach's bio, his mini bio of Alex Niño, to give us the final remaining context we need. And then we can kind of dive into our discussion of the comic at hand here from DC, Space Clusters, the terribly named Space Clusters, which really, I think, is in the running for one of the worst titled comic books of all time. I mean, it's got some serious competition, to be sure, but really, what the fuck is a space cluster? Why would you name a comic book Space Clusters, particularly a comic book that is so gorgeously illustrated? It's almost perverse to give a comic book that looks this beautiful such a clunky and horrid sounding name. It's just a terrible name, and it does, connect to the story, but that's no excuse. It's an awful name. So that's a shame, but what are you going to do? All right, here we go. David Roach, extraordinary artist in his own right, and UK comics art historian par excellence, has this great personal sort of mini bio on Alex Niño here. And he says, along with Jack Kirby, Moebius, and Breccia, Alex Niño is one of comics' few genuine visionaries. With a unique style and seemingly limitless imagination, like so many Filipinos, his earliest U.S. work was for DC's horror comics, where he drew 58 strips through the 70s, and for Pendulum Press's Classic series. In addition to the mystery strips, which were often decorated with extraordinary imagery, Niño drew the gorgeous Space Voyagers strip in Rima the Jungle Girl, the occasional Korak strip in Tarzan, and the memorable pirate strip Captain Fear in Adventure Comics. In the mid-70s, he augmented his DC work with sporadic Marvel strips, including a bunch of stuff there, including Conan. And then in the late 70s, Niño moved over to Warren, where the total artistic freedom offered by that company completely unfettered his already prodigious imagination. Altogether, Alex Niño drew 64 amazing strips for Warren, mostly for the magazine 1984, which was later renamed 1994. The most stunning work of all of that was something called Young Sigmund Pavlov, and it was a series of strips that he drew for that magazine. This was very much Niño's greatest creative period, during which he also drew for Byron Price. He did something called More Than Human, and he released portfolios for the fan market and produced his own art book, Satan's Tears, which is a pretty provocative title, I gotta say. And that book is going for around $500 online these days, if you're lucky enough to find it. Clearly a very limited print run. Following the collapse of Warren, however, Niño found work harder to come by, and so he did sporadic assignments at Pacific for Bold Adventures. He did work at Archie Comics, of all places, where he worked on The Comet, inking his old buddy Carmine Infantino, and he even picked up some work at DC, where he did some kind of fill-in work, taking over on titles like Thriller and Omega Men. Alex Niño actually came on to Thriller, a comic that we've spent no small amount of time gushing over on this channel. And of course, we talked about the Trevor Von Eden run on Thriller, but Alex Niño was the one who came in at the end there and drew the final few issues of Thriller, which unfortunately were not as fully formed from a story sense or a narrative sense as the initial part of Thriller. But, I think that was the thing with Nino's work is like, I think he couldn't catch a break when it came to just finding a significant thing that he could do for the American market. Like he never got sort of like the signature work that, let's say, a Bernie Wrightson got or a Moebius got or anything like that. There aren't these signature works with Niño quite the same way. Certainly none that achieved the status of like Wrightson's Frankenstein or Moebius's Incal or Blueberry even. Unfortunately for Niño, a lot of the best work he did was these shorter strips for Warren Publishing and a lot of these backups for DC, which David Roach is calling out here for Adventure Comics, etc. And I think that makes it really tough for an artist to kind of really have the sort of legendary status they deserve if they don't have that one giant signature work. And it's really unfortunate, but that appears to be the case here with Niño. So yeah, he also drew what else did he draw? Yeah, so for DC he did Thriller and Omega Men, but then after that, I think he wasn't getting the kind of work he deserved in the comic business. And so for much of his career after that, he went on to animation and he worked on stuff for Disney. He worked on Mulan and Tarzan behind the scenes, and he got more financially rewarding work, but it was a tremendous loss for comics. And so that's some of the history for Alex Niño. And all of that brings us to Space Clusters, this very strange science fiction story, which DC released in this unique graphic album kind of European style format in the 80s. And it's a bizarre work, and there's really not very much written about it online. And I can't really find Arthur Byron Cover or Alex Niño speaking about it themselves anywhere. And there are even precious few reviews of the work. And the reviews that I did find were quite dismissive of the story, at least the second half of the story. And we can get into the reasons for why. But the reviews I did see were significantly complimentary and effusive about Niño's work, which is appropriate because I really can't imagine anyone looking at Alex Niño's drawing and being anything other than wildly complimentary. You would have to be partially blind, or I suppose you would just have to have a very, very different kind of taste in comic book art than I do in order to not love Niño's work. But hey, you never know. There are people who don't like Moebius, I suppose. But all right. So having said all that, hopefully everyone has the necessary context. I can also just say that Alex Niño is still alive today, and he is, his work is still being produced and sold, and you can find it online. I actually got to meet Mr. Niño about 5 years ago at a convention here in California. It was a great honor to meet him. He was incredibly kind and cool, and I believe his son was there with him, and I bought a print off of him, and it was just a lovely experience getting to see him in real life there. And so everybody please look for Alex's work and see if you can find him and, purchase something online. I'm sure the Niño family would appreciate it, and it's the least we can do to show our appreciation for a guy who genuinely is a living legend. And, Moebius is not with us today, and so many of the all-time greats are not with us. And can you imagine if you could contact Moebius or his family and buy an original signed print? Well, you can't do that, but you could do that with Niño's family, and I think that's kind of amazing. So yeah. Something to remember. And with all that being said, I think we should talk about Space Clusters and just what a weird kettle of fish this particular science fiction story really is. Okay, so I want to give everybody just a little bit of a comparison that popped into my mind in regard to my first experience glimpsing the work of Alex Niño. And I know I had come across his work here and there, just probably in various kind of random one-shots or fill-ins that he did that I might have seen, or inking jobs he might have done, but I hadn't really been tuned in or truly aware of just his genius and his own kind of singular idiosyncratic voice as an artist. And I believe I would say it was probably when I met Alex Niño at WonderCon here in Southern California, probably about, I don't know, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, something like that. And I saw the work he had on his table, just in his portfolio, or that his son let me flip through. I was astonished. Like, my jaw was on the floor, and I just couldn't believe the level of artist that he was, sitting here, just this kindly older gentleman, kind of sketching away. And I literally felt like I was in the presence of, you know, like I say, like a Moebius type of person. That level of artistic, once in a lifetime kind of talent. And that's not a comparison that I would make lightly. And so all I can compare it to is just, this is going to seem like a little bit of an odd metaphor, but, go with me on this for a moment. Let's just imagine. Now, I'm not saying any of this really happened, mind you, but let's just imagine that when I was 22 years old, perhaps, that if I had had an experience where, say, somebody gave me a whole lot of dried grams of psychedelic mushrooms, let's say way beyond what your average psychonaut might refer to as a quote unquote heroic dose. And let's say, again, of course, not saying that this actually happened, but let's say that I did kind of gobble up um, 10 or 20 or 30 grams of psychedelic mushrooms. And let's say that I kind of left my body and went into just a bizarre sort of a insanely psychedelic hallucinogenic state for, you know, a whole lot of hours, and felt like I was communing with what appeared to be a highly sentient alien intelligence that got me to completely question everything I'd assumed about reality in the preceding 22 years. And let's say that I came back to consensus reality with an entirely radically shifted understanding of life and reality and existence and all of this. And let's say that at that moment, if such a crazy sort of experience had happened to me, I might have been struck. I might have been struck by the thought that this was just completely insane, that this sort of a substance existed on this planet, and that everybody in the world wasn't completely stopping what they were doing to talk about this and to talk about the sort of experiences and entities and sort of realities that we are able to commune with and experience. Why on earth, if this actually was possible and existed, wasn't this sort of stopping the world for everyone and stopping reality for everyone? This would be the kind of thing that one might think if one might have had such an experience. Not that I actually did, but I have, an imagination, and I'm trying to construct an accurate metaphor here. And so, to bring this around to Alex Nino, all I can say is that was the kind of thought that struck me as I was standing on the floor of WonderCon there, looking through his portfolio. I just could not imagine why Alex Nino was not a bigger deal in the world of comic books, even for somebody like myself. And I considered myself to be, a pretty well versed comic book geek who had spent most of my life really studying comics to an absurd degree, and I was still only just barely aware of the work of Alex Nino at that moment. And it seemed just an unconscionable thing to me that a guy with this level of genius was not being celebrated and kind of, talked about by everyone in the industry, when obviously far, far, far lesser talents and far lesser visual stylists are widely celebrated and acclaimed in comics. I couldn't imagine why somebody like Alex Nino was not somebody that was spoken of, in the conversations of the great comic book artists of the world. So anyway, having said all of that, I hope that this video will get at least a few people to consider looking at the work of Mr. Nino through that particular prism, because I do believe that he stands shoulder to shoulder with every one of the all-time greats in the world of comics, and that includes my own favorites like your Jack Kirby's and anyone else you can think of. And really, I think some of the only American artists I can think of to compare Nino's work to are Kirby and perhaps Walt Simonson in terms of the more adventurous of Simonson's work. I'm thinking and also his line work in particular, which has more of a jagged, angular quality to it, more so than most American artists. I'm thinking in particular of some of Simonson's better work, in the 70s and 80s, like the Alien adaptation he did, which was beautiful, and also later on the Michael Moorcock multiverse adaptation that Simonson did, which is one of my favorite things he ever did. That was actually in the 90s, and it's not spoken about as much, but of course Simonson's had such a legendary career of astonishing breadth, and has done so many legendary things. The Kirby Orion New Gods miniseries, or just, I guess, limited series. It turned out to be 20 issues or whatever that Simonson did, and then of the staggering work on Thor and his incredible run on Thor. But yeah, I think that Simonson's a good comparable in a way with the most epic of his work, and then Kirby is probably an even better comparable. But even that still doesn't do justice to the just unbelievably fertile imagination of Nino, because really Nino is he's all over the place, folks. And this artwork on space clusters gives only a small example of one chamber, so to speak, of Nino's work. But much like some of the absolute greatest comic artists of all time, your Bernie Krigsteins and your Kirbys and your Moebiuses, Nino was able to switch it up and work in a stunning variety of styles as well, and genres. And it's an incredible career has spanned now around 5 decades or so. And he's still out there making work. So it's a wonderful time to celebrate Alex Nino, and I really appreciate everybody checking out this video. And really, the main thing I would urge everyone to do is to seek out some Alex Nino work. Go find it on Google and go look it up, and find it out there wherever you can. Unfortunately, a lot of his best stuff that I've been looking at here has not totally been collected, or some of the stuff that has been collected is out of print. Nino did some amazing work for DC's Weird War Tales, and there was a great kind of black and white collection of that came out like around a decade or more ago, but that's out of print, going for like $100 now, that DC showcase volume of Weird War Tales. So unfortunately, Nino's work, a lot of it's hard to find. And that's really, really a damn shame. But whatever you can find, snatch it up, because as far as I can tell, Alex Nino has never drawn anything less than a beautiful comic, just some more beautiful than others. I would say maybe his Warren magazine work might be some of my favorite work of his personally. So if you can find any of those old Warren magazines, your Eries, your Creepies, 1984, just snatch those up. There's a particular issue that was an all Alex Nino issue of either Eerie or Creepy. I want to say it was issue 119 of one of those. That's definitely worth seeking out. Okay, so that's that. And now I think that we should get on to some discussion of the comic, which is ostensibly the focal point of this little episode of Comics Rot Your Brain. So without further ado, I would love to talk with y'all about space clusters. And again, it's quite the unfortunate name. So, Space Clusters was written by Arthur Byron Cover, who is a science fiction author and a prose stylist in large part, but he dabbled in comics a bit. He was somebody who I think was somewhat perhaps associated with Harlan Ellison, if I recall. I think Cover's work might have first been published in some of Harlan Ellison's famous Dangerous Visions sci-fi prose anthologies. And so Arthur Byron Cover is kind of coming out of that school of science fiction as a writer. And honestly, I think the reviews of Space Clusters that I've seen have not totally done justice to his writing here, because I think he does a fairly impressive job with the story in a lot of ways. It's hard to not be outshined by the artwork of Alex Niño here. I think that honestly, you would have to be a comic writer of the skill set of somebody like an Alan Moore in order to really actually be able to kind of hang with this Alex Nino art, because it's so good. Like, you got to write a goddamn masterpiece, as a writer to really kind of measure up to this. And like, okay, maybe the Arthur Byron Cover story isn't quite as wildly impressive as the artwork, but I also think it's not exactly chopped liver either. And I think it's an engaging story and it's worth reading. So it's about a space bounty hunter who has been spending much of her life hunting one particular outlaw, and his name is Ethan Dyack. And this space bounty hunter named Lieutenant Kara Basuto, it says here on one of the opening pages of Space Clusters, she has pursued the rogue Ethan Dyack throughout the galaxy for 100 years, and she's been asleep in her ship's suspendo chamber for 80, yet has aged only 15. Okay, so Arthur Byron Cover is giving you like a little math word problem right away in the first couple pages of the story. I don't know if that's a good idea, but all right. So she's been searching for him for 100 years. She's been asleep in a suspendo chamber for 80. She's aged 15. What does that mean? I don't think it really matters. Okay, but so the world that Kara knew has changed forever. Here I'm quoting from some of the text in the story that's in the captions. It says, "What's left of Kara's friends and family are relics of a bygone age. She hopes that the beauty and the peace of Earth have been sustained. The news of her homeworld is rare and elusive, all of it vague." And then we go into a little flashback. She remembers her first meeting with Dyack. So yeah, Arthur Byron Cover kind of throws us into the story with very little setup. Like, we're just kind of hurled into it in media res, so to speak. There's not a lot of time to kind of get our bearings. And then we quickly meet this smuggler, this suspected art smuggler and criminal on the run, Ethan Dyack. And it says here, he was long a suspected art smuggler who had just become a recent suspect for murder. How ironic that the small-time thug would one day become the most famous, feared, and loved rogue in the galaxy, the subject of 100 legends, many concerning how he had escaped at the last moment from a certain Terran interplanetary officer. And that is the aforementioned Lieutenant Kara Basuto there. And so we find out here about Ethan's first escape from Kara, and, we kind of rush through it pretty quickly. The one thing about the story here from Arthur Byron Cover is that it's extremely minimal when it comes to the writing, particularly for this time period in the 80s. It's very decompressed storytelling. And although this is like an extended European graphic album format, I mean, these pages go by fast. And if you read it, it's really quite a fast read, which honestly is smart, because you kind of want to get the fuck out of the way for this Alex Nino artwork, because you're looking at this artwork and it's just jaw-dropping. It's just virtuosic, breathtaking alien landscapes. And I think Arthur Byron Cover deserves some credit for being smart enough to just get the fuck out of the way, man, because this is amazing looking stuff. So for example, there's a page here early on that just has this unbelievable looking alien kind of architecture water with a giant moon in the background. And it says, after 2 years of searching, Kara tracked him to the paltry world of Scuzzle, so dismal that even the destitute tried to avoid it. And that's almost the only text on that is the only text on the whole page, really. And then there's just a brief word balloon from Ethan talking to some alien, but that's basically it. That's the whole page. And so we're just kind of zooming through the story pretty quickly. She's hunting for him. He's on the run. He's on this weird planet Scuzzle. And then she catches him. Okay, Kara catches him, and she's been chasing him forever, of course. But then there's some stuff here that's a little contrived or a little sort of unbelievable, I should say, where she says, "Don't even blink, Dayek," and she says, "You've got a few rights, but not many." And so she's caught him, right, after all these years of searching, et cetera, et cetera. And then he says, "Okay, can I stop at my digs and pack for my trip?" Which is like, what? Like, you're the number one space criminal in the galaxy. This bounty hunter's been chasing you for how many years? And she's going to let you go pack? He says, "I'd like to say a goodbye too." And I'm like, what? Like, huh? What bounty hunter's going to let you do all this? But then she says, "Why not? I can afford to waste a few minutes." Which is just like totally unbelievable to me. I'm just thinking this is a terrible bounty hunter, but okay. But honestly, I think frankly, it's just a little clunky writing. I just think that's just not the most elegant way to handle that writing wise. But all right, let's have him go say his goodbye because clearly we need that for the plot. So she says, "All right, Dayek. Why are these natives here so angry at your capture? What lies have you told them about Earth?" "Not a one. You sound like the sheriff of Nottingham." "Who? Oh, never mind." So, okay, there's some goofy dialogue there a little bit. And then he says to her, when he gets to his little home on this alien planet of Scuzzle, he says, "I'd like a few moments of privacy if you don't mind." And our bounty hunter says, "Sure, I'm feeling generous today. Just remember, our scanning devices will be attuned." Again, totally unbelievable. Like, really just way too convenient, but whatever. So turns out he's got an alien girlfriend who is something called a vegan, which, yeah, it's spelled like a vegan, but it's not what we think of as a vegan. They are apparently one of the most pious races in the galaxy. And Kara thinks, what's she doing in this pen with that pig? And the vegan girlfriend is named Ashoka. And this is, no relation to the current Star Wars Ashoka. And he says, "Hey, greetings, my girlfriend Ashoka. As your people might say, the time of dread has come to us. Don't fret, honey. We've had some good times together. Besides, we both knew this moment might come someday." And she's very romantic, this alien vegan. She says, Star stuff shines through your soul, Ethan, and your heart beats as one with mine." And we hear our bounty hunter kind of making fun of this in her mind. And then Ethan says to the vegan, "I can ensure that our souls always remain entwined. Ashoka, how can I say everything in only a few seconds?" And she says, "Say nothing. Merely take this amulet. It's the home of my family's spirit. Through it, we may always be near." She gives him an amulet, and then he takes off and he escapes because, of course, he does. Because the bounty hunter let him, get out of her sight, and he's the most wanted man in the galaxy, and of course he escapes. And so then the bounty hunter Kara, our main character here, so to speak, is really pissed at this alien vegan girlfriend because she's like, "Where is he? Vegan? Where has Dayek gone?" And the girlfriend says, "He's gone forever, woman. Never shall we know his kind again. My soul lies in darkness. My life has been ruined." And now we see Ethan's thinking the same thing as he's running off through an alien gutter with little alien dinosaur rats staring at him. And now we see that Kara is super pissed. The bounty hunter is super pissed that the vegan girlfriend let him get away. And Kara does something pretty awful. She just straight up murders this poor vegan girlfriend who's, this kind of like spiritual alien who happens to just be in love with this dude. And, she hasn't done anything really illegal herself, per se. I mean, I don't know. Was it illegal for her to be kind of, coupled up with this guy? I mean, who knows? But our bounty hunter just straight up murders the vegan, throws her down a pit of this trap door in the place, and looks like she like breaks her neck basically. And then Kara says, "My God, I've become a killer, just like Dayak," which I suppose is something kind of original here about the story, that our main character is a woman who's a badass bounty hunter and a murderer. And so that's kind of a unique thing for comics in the 80s. It's rather dark, I would say. She's a bit of an anti-hero, but don't worry, this comic Space Clusters, the horrendously named Space Clusters, is about to get a whole lot weirder and, not necessarily worse, but a whole lot weirder. So then Kara, she lies to her bounty hunting buddies. She says that the vegan committed suicide, which clearly, she did not. And then she finds out that vegans are connected to higher dimensions, and they're a very spiritual race of aliens. And so then we find out a bit more about Kara and Kara's life. We have some beautiful flashback pages to when Kara was growing up, and how she had been sort of selected to do what she does because in this alien future world, conformity was the most highly valued thing. And we see in a flashback that Kara, our young bounty hunter, when she's growing up, her conformity scores had always been very high. Early in life, she tested really high at this. And she also had high altruistic leanings, a marked potential to sacrifice herself for the good of others, because she had been particularly adept at defining what that good should be. The social managers assigned her to a psych ward. She was trained to kill in the line of duty, but not to commit murder necessarily. But we see that she was kind of brainwashed into becoming this state-sponsored bounty hunter that she's become. And she's reflecting here, perhaps her perceptions of life had been tainted. After all, in order to distinguish between constructive and destructive work, you needed to know the symbolic codes. The writing's getting fairly dense and kind of a little bit cerebral here. You can see why the story didn't necessarily connect with the wider comic reading public here. Now, Ethan had been a purveyor of so-called contraband art on Earth. He was an art smuggler. We come to realize, though, that like popular art had basically been outlawed on Earth in the future. So some of the contraband that Ethan had been smuggling had been like cartoons, and all of this visual contraband had been outlawed. And it wasn't long when Ethan started dealing this stuff, this illegal art that he was selling like a drug. It wasn't long before Ethan became immersed in the underground of these contraband visual arts in this future world. And at first, he was amused by the humor, fascinated by the violence, and enticed by the lure of money. But he soon discovered that without realizing it, he'd grown to appreciate the paintings and the movies. Instead of a mere purveyor, he became a caretaker, bringing this material to the other few capable of appreciating it. And we see like a beautiful page of like, animated bunny rabbits and like, stills from a Western film and some other kind of movie looking stills. And we see Ethan getting rich as a purveyor of all this contraband popular art and storytelling, and a caretaker who lived like a king, lusting after all the luxuries money could buy, which includes an incredibly cute little baby dinosaur pet that's kind of seated next to him, like a little dog next to his ornate throne. So it's just, all of this is such an amazing excuse for Nino to just draw his ass off, like unbelievable visuals, which you guys are hopefully appreciating in the video here. The story, though, I'll be honest, it does come across as a little bit, I don't want to say slapdash, but it comes across as like not carefully considered or laid out enough. It honestly feels like a good first draft or a second draft of a story. But like I say, when you're collaborating with Alex Niño, you might want to go kind of back to the old word processor at the time and really just craft something that's a little bit more fully formed, so to speak, because the story, he's got a ton of interesting and rather compelling ideas going on here. And I won't say that it doesn't. There are really some very cool ideas at play in this Arthur Byron cover story. It just doesn't feel like too many of them are fully formed. It feels like a great bunch of ideas in a kind of a stew where nothing really quite comes to a boil. I don't know if I'm mixing metaphors here, but I think you guys probably get my point. Anyways, what we should get to is like where the story goes in its second half, which is, I think, what probably pissed off the most people when they read it. Because the first half, although it's choppy, it's basically your traditional space bounty hunter story, which is kind of funny because my esteemed colleague Chris Derrick here at CRYB Central, he also, of course, in his last solo episode, he profiled a space bounty hunter story, Howard Chaykin's Monarch Starstalker. And Chris and I did not really coordinate this on purpose because I had already had it in my mind that I was going to do a different Alex Niño story for this episode, and then I just kind of didn't like the way the art from that story was looking for the video that I was going to do here, because it was black and white and I felt like it wasn't translating as well. And so I kind of switched up my game plan to do space clusters instead, and suddenly I'm doing a space bounty hunter from space bounty hunter story, just like Monarch Starstalker. So kind of a weird synchronicity there, because, you know, how many space bounty hunters have we had in comics? I mean, you know, we've had a few, but yeah, this is, you know, it's not going to become the only topic of our show, I promise. But in this case, the first half of it is a kind of a traditional story in that vein, and now the second half is about to go way, way wacky in a way that's kind of unexpected. So here, Ethan is pissed because he feels that his girlfriend, the vegan named Ashoka, has been murdered. And although he has escaped from Kara the bounty hunter, because Ethan's got his girlfriend's magical amulet, he feels Ashoka is gone. I can feel it through the amulet. I really am all alone. And then he goes on to think to himself in thought balloons, which, you know, Chris and I love here at Comics Rot Your Brain. We're big fans of the thought balloons, hoping we can bring those back in comics today. Ethan thinks to himself, that bitch Basuto, she thinks she can handle anything the universe can throw at her. We'll find out about that. I'm plotting a course that will take me clean out of this galaxy. I'll never have anything to do with the human race again. And if Basuto's crazy enough to follow me through uncharted space, that's all right with me. I'll be free if it takes an eternity. Sensors show that she's gone into suspendo. Good. The longer it takes to catch him. Wait, I'm sorry. This is like switching to Kara's point of view now. She's now thinking to herself in her separate spaceship. Sensors show that he's gone into suspendo. Good. The longer it takes to catch him, the better it's going to feel. I'll set the controls on lock and lock coordinates. And if it takes an eternity, Ethan Dyack, I'll catch up to you and make you pay for all the refuse you're leaving behind. Okay, so let's remember we set up this idea of going into suspendo mode early on in the story with Kara. Now we see Ethan doing it too, and it's just something that, you know, these folks are doing while in the midst of interstellar travel. And, you know, it's something of a time-worn trope in sci-fi. You go into kind of a hibernation chamber on your spaceship while you're traveling through light years or whatnot. We don't really know the exact science here, and I don't know that we care, but that's the general idea. And so now this turns into some really wild hallucinogenic stuff now. Starting from the midpoint of the story, we're basically going into a whole lot of full page spreads, which are just amazing, just jaw-dropping, just really gobsmacking, many full page spreads. And it's just a wild opportunity for Niño to strut his stuff in terms of cosmic psychedelic madness. And oh boy, does he ever. The page designs, the colors, it's all breathtaking, folks. You can see it in the video here. And so what happens here is crazy. So we see in the text, it says Their ships skip jump space, materializing time after time in uncharted regions. Ethan and Kara do not exactly dream, but their subconscious minds continuously sift through old memories. Space lore is full of indefinite trips through space. The tales have one thing in common. The heroes never return to their native galaxy. Their fates are never known to any species that matters to them. The actual trip is a lot shorter than it could have been, because after their 60th or so skip jump through uncharted space, their ships materialize trapped in the tremendous gravity well of a black hole. As the shape of space curves, so does the shape of their ships. Enough delicate machinery is damaged to ensure that Ethan and Kara remain in suspendo despite the emergency situation. And we have an incredible page of the two ships being kind of like seemingly ripped apart in the midst of this well inside of the black hole. And then from here, how many things can happen in a second? One instant they're outside the black hole, and then they're past the event horizon where not even the light waves can escape the forces of gravity. How long is an instant? The ships and bodies inside change to keep pace with the fluctuating geometry of existence. Atoms stretch, molecules begin to merge, then all space flattens to a single plane. Time ceases to exist. Ethan and Kara, their ships, and the flowing debris of matter around them remain separate and distinct, superimposed over each other in the absolute flatness. Ethan and Kara sense but cannot comprehend their approaching deaths. They only know that what has been must go, that what has gone will rise again. Okay, so this is getting super wild here. So stay with Arthur Byron Cover, as what's about to happen is very unexpected. Flesh and blood, suspendo fluids, forged metal, and space debris are compressed and amalgamated into new forms, but the minds resist with stubborn determination. Given strength and vigor by their hatred and the spiritual residue inside the amulet, the minds expand and intensify, reaching out to snapshots of consciousness which flicker in and out of the submerged memories of what it was like to be human. Then the instant has passed, the second is over, they've come into another universe. Ethan and Kara, or what they have become, ride the currents of space with ease. They are perfectly attuned to them. They avoid debris and pools of hot gases alike with the ease of accomplished navigators. They have become space clusters, amalgamations of flesh, metal, and star stuff, fashioned as much by repressed, inarticulated desire as by their fantastic journey. Okay, so that is where our title comes from. Okay, are we all following with this? Our two characters, our two flesh and blood human characters in our sci-fi story, the bounty hunter and her prey, the art smuggler, have now become amalgamations of their own flesh, along with the metal of their ships and quote unquote star stuff. And all of this kind of welded together by the mystical power of the magical vegan amulet. And it's also fashioned just as much by repressed, inarticulated desire as by their fantastic journey. Okay, now you would be forgiven for thinking that this was a whole bunch of writerly gobbledygook, because on some level it kind of is. And I think that unlike a writer like, and Alan Moore, somebody who maybe has the skill set as a writer to translate these ideas into something that is more emotionally resonant and immediately comprehensible and affecting to the average reader. I think that Arthur Byron Cover's prose is a bit dense and, dare I say, impenetrable or distancing in a lot of ways, where I feel like it probably didn't serve this particular comic the best. But it is a fascinating idea, and I'm more fascinated than anything that the editors at DC were willing to go along with this and just be like, yeah, cool. Okay, last 20, 30 pages of the story, you want to turn your characters into like these weird space cluster things that are kind of like these non-human weird entities that just kind of like float through a whole bunch of full page spreads and have like weird sort of text experiences that they're talking about in little text boxes as as Alex Niño is drawing a whole bunch of outer space stuff, okay, cool. Why not go for it? Let them be these weird godlike entities, kind of reminiscing and talking about their philosophies on existence and reality and space, because that's kind of what happens. And it's really pretty wild. And it speaks to the level of experimentation that was permitted at and even encouraged at DC Comics in the 80s, under the incredible tenure of one of our favorite people here at CRYB, the amazing and phenomenal Jeanette Kahn, who allowed and really wanted a whole lot of freedom for the artists here. And you see what they were allowed to do, which is just so bananas. Like, this is batshit, folks. Like, what happens next is like this. If I had actually had the aforementioned heroic dose of psilocybin mushrooms when I was 22, and if I had kind of departed into a cosmic realm for some time that felt like I was returning to the source of all existence and having a completely different perspective on the origin of reality and life as I knew it, I would say that experience was, somewhat analogous to these final 20 or 30 pages of Space Clusters. And so it's not that I don't have an appreciation for this. It actually is kind of poignant and feels like a very synchronistic experience for me, to be sort of connecting the Alex Niño art to that, psychedelic mushroom trip that may or may not have happened. And this work itself, I mean, it all is like, it's a valuable reading experience for what it is, just because it's so deeply bizarre. And oh my God, is it gorgeous to look at. So anyways, I'm not going to read this whole thing to you folks, but let me just quote a few more passages so you get a sense of what the vibe is. We go on to learn that they are still peacefully asleep. Birth in this new realm, apparently, held no pains, no terrors for them. They will have a chance to get used to the fact of being alive before facing the trauma and travail of existence. And as the embryonic solar system cools and fans out around them, they begin to figure out who they are this time, in dreams tainted by vague images of their past lives. Okay, that was a whole page. They nurture the images of their dreams in fertile energy fields. Strands of former impulses and desires weave, strengthening and growing into new personalities. They begin to realize they live in a universe that is as much a toy as a home, that they possess virtually unlimited powers with infinite possibilities. That was another page. For a time, they swim through currents together. Then they drift apart, each sleeping, mind only subconsciously aware of the other, as their sensory organs gather and analyze the raw data of their new lives according to the residue of their former personalities. This is just fucking wild. This is wild that DC Comics put this out as a graphic novel. This is like Jim Starlin, psychedelic 70s visionary madness, but without even any of the superhero kind of an overlay on it. This is just straight up psychedelic space opera with only, frankly, the thinnest veneer of space opera in that first half of the story. But now we're just into just crazy psychedelic Spaceville. And this is just so nutty. I cannot even imagine the pitch to DC Comics and how this was approved. I mean, just wildness. Really, really props to everybody involved. The lettering, by the way, was done by the legendary Todd Klein. The book design was by Richard Bruning. Wait a second, this book was edited by Julia Schwartz. That is nutty to me. And I know Julia Schwartz was, obviously an editor that was at DC for a very, very long time and became a signature editor there, and was later known to be somewhat controversial because he was actually said to have been rather untoward in his and inappropriate in his dealings with some folks, and so that's unfortunate. And I don't know enough about that to touch on that in any level of detail. But I will say that Julius Schwartz also came from the world of science fiction and science fiction writing. I believe that was his background prior to coming to DC, and so maybe Julius had an appreciation for this level of psychedelic rumination and science in a science fiction context. Maybe he did, or maybe he was just like too busy doing other shit to really even edit this book. Maybe he just rubber stamped it and got a vanity credit. I don't know. Jeanette Kahn is the president and publisher of this book. We're hoping to be talking to Jeanette on this show at some point in the near future, and so I will definitely be asking Jeanette if she remembers approving space clusters. Dick Giordano, another CRYB favorite, he was the executive editor of this book. Did anybody read this thing? I'm genuinely curious. Bob Rozakis was the production manager. Paul Levitz was the executive VP at the time. Joe Orlando is the creative director. Man, I'm so curious if anyone there actually read this, because it's so nutty. I just don't know how this thing got approved through the whole chain of command. But anyways, just to get back to where we left off, our main characters are discarnate entities, godlike beings that are a mishmash of metal and star stuff and flesh and mystical energy. They're kind of, ricocheting through dimensions and black holes and whatnot. And, we can skip over a few pages here. They start being referred to as separate clusters, hence the terrible title. And so we start referring to them rather awkwardly as the E cluster and the K cluster. Get it? Ethan cluster, Kara cluster. Yeah, that particular decision, I think, could have used an editor. That's a particularly clunky solution for how to refer to them. But okay, whatever. So I am alone, thinks the E cluster. One Ethan, I have awakened and I'm alone. I sense some kind of previous incarnation, but can't remember. I try, but cannot. At least I've advanced analytical abilities, but how can this be? Strange, this galaxy is desolate. Despite plentiful raw material of various atomic densities, how can I be? I've no precedent, no evolutionary chain behind me. Wait, a spark of life amidst the desolation. I am not alone. I've a sister, thinks the E cluster, spitting out a psychic communication bolt. Okay, now we have a new series of text boxes in a different color, which is nice. The K cluster, once Kara sleeps, contact. And so this cluster has been contacted by the other cluster with a psychic bolt. The E cluster thinks, I've never communicated before. What do I do now? Must wait, be patient. And then we see that they start communicating between each other. The K cluster finds her awakening to be rude and abrupt. So she's just coming to like sentience in this new realm, in this new form. This is just so bonkers. Like, what am I reading? What was that in my mind, she thinks. What am I? I sense around myself a galaxy, calm, at rest, as it should be. I am here alone, except for that thing in my mind. What was it? Perhaps a shadow self of some sort. Wait, I sense a tremendous blight of motes. Can I have been mistaken? What else could possibly exist here? Oh, I see life. Life has no ideals, thinks the K cluster. It will do anything to survive. It must be eradicated. This is just fucking... I don't even know what to say, guys. Like, what are we reading? In a sense, I am in awe, and I have so much respect for this. This reminds me in a way of some of my favorite Alan Moore writing in Promethea, where things get really, really out there and adventurous and ambitious. But again, I think the thing that Moore has the ability to do, just because of his, unprecedented level of craft as probably the greatest comic book writer of all time, Moore has an ability to string this kind of more esoteric and fanciful writing. He has the ability to string it together with a cohesive, emotionally grounded narrative that somehow makes sense of it all, which Arthur Byron Cover, I don't believe necessarily has a grasp of. And so it's still obviously very worthwhile. Otherwise, I wouldn't be talking about this book and profiling it here. I think it's still very worth checking out. And purely for the artwork, it's worth checking out. But I do think the story is fascinating. I mean, it's genuinely fascinating that he was allowed to do this, that they were allowed to do this, and that they did. And Niño clearly went all in. He obviously was a more than willing collaborator, and he took the ball and ran with it to an unbelievable degree. I mean, there's really no way that we would be talking about this book if Alex Niño hadn't illustrated it, because, I mean, it would be a great curiosity in a sense, but I think the fact that Niño illustrated it so staggeringly makes this a lot more fun to look at. Anyway, the story, such as it is, continues to go on in this incredibly esoteric and deeply bizarre way. We have all kinds of space happenings going on between aliens, various alien races kind of communicating or having battle with our two cluster entities. It's really hard to even kind of wrap your hands around it. We see the E cluster recreating, to the best of his knowledge, a battle legendary in the history of some planet. In order to ensure a spirited recreation, the E cluster awes the armies with his presence, fills them with thoughts of their god. Forget the pain, ignore the horror. Remember, 13 centuries of animosity have led you to this turning point in history. Now get out there and fight. And so, kind of in a way, these clusters have become gods, and they're literally creating their own worlds and their own races of creatures to then reenact wars that they remember. Like, what the fuck was Arthur Byron Cover smoking or doing when he wrote the story? Now, I did hear Alex Niño on the record saying he had never partaken of psychedelics. I have heard no such statement from Arthur Byron Cover. And so that would be an incredible question to ask, which I have not seen any interview with Mr. Cover where he discussed this, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say that perhaps Arthur Byron Cover had ingested some psychedelics at some point, because I'm finding it hard to believe that he wrote this story in a completely sober frame of mind. But who knows? So we go on. I can't even begin to summarize some of the stuff that's happening. The clusters, the K cluster, the E cluster, things are happening. Something happens, aliens are blowing up. Things are going bzzzt and zap and blah, blah, blah. And then suddenly we see another beautiful full-page Niño spread almost. And it says, "My mind feels like it's sinking. Is this death? What's happening around me? Is everything I've accomplished in my short life already being obliterated? Self senses sister. She is near. Maybe she really does care. Must call out, must reach. No need to call, thinks the K cluster. I'm already here. I couldn't resist watching your final moments." The E cluster does not answer. Instead, he instinctively spits out a psychic bolt. "Ah, so this is ecstasy. Ugh, what are you doing to me?" The K cluster likewise spits out a bolt. "Get out of my mind." How long is an instant? The E cluster's death vision is of the fast approaching border of an event horizon, then nothing. All wavelengths indicate no evidence of thought. My shadow self is dead, the natural order restored. What now? Where is the harmony I thought I would gain? I don't even know. I don't even know what to say here. This started out as a story of a bounty hunter trying to catch a space criminal. We are now in just such deeply, deeply whacked out cosmic territory. I don't even know what to say. Burn the bodies, disintegrate the ashes, let not one microorganism go forth. You of the hive have proven yourself to be a natural arm of the way, an ally of the logical decree of matter. You have earned the right to exist. All you must do to keep that right is leave me alone. I mean, it's almost like slam poetry. This whole thing, it's almost like psychedelic slam poetry set to the visuals of the astonishing Alex Niño, which, I mean, honestly, I'm here for it. That's fucking cool. It's a hell of a lot less boring than 99% of comic books. So, I'm not trying to be glib here. This is actually a very worthwhile comic. It's just deeply, deeply bizarre. It just doesn't have what you would typically think of as characters or story happening the way you expect it. Okay, so we're on the very last page here. And the last page, we have some insanely designed aliens sitting on like a slab of rock. Half of them are like throwing themselves into like a fiery cosmic pit. The other half are like sitting on the top of giant dinosaurs with giant space guns. I don't even know what to say, but it looks fucking rad. It looks awesome. And then the text says, "Later, when the K cluster has been undetected by probes for several hours, the hub permits itself to relax, permitting some perceptive latitude with the parts on the fringe. Wait, what? Later, when the K cluster has been undetected by probes for several hours, the hub permits itself to relax, permitting some perceptive latitude with the parts on the fringe. Okay, I guess. This is the wrap up. This is where we're supposed to be making sense of the story. The word balloon here says, "We do not recall previous battles with such sadness. Never has so much been lost for so little gain. But we, not responsible for all that has happened here, can gods die? Stone cut with such intransigent spirit. Strange, how rock sings to my heart. Nexus cannot explain. Stranger still. Wait, what's this? Should we? Yes." And now we see this little alien warrior finding the mystical amulet that the vegan had given to our bounty hunter. And this little cute little alien warrior guy, he picks up this amulet and he says, "Wait, what's this? Should we?" Yes. I'll keep it. And I'll is bolded. So we have to emphasize that. I'll keep it. Exclamation point. End of story. That's it. That's the end of Space Clusters. And I don't even know what to say. This was probably an exercise in futility or madness trying to discuss this story, much less summarize it. But I hope that you guys have enjoyed my read through / reenactment of this deeply batshit insane and just gorgeously drawn story that is a visual masterwork and is a bit of a narrative curiosity in terms of the way it is written, but one half of it is a fairly conventional space bounty hunter story, and the other half of it is, I really don't know what, but it's a poetic spectacle that is a singular experience, and I hope you've enjoyed experiencing part of that with me today here on Comics Rot Your Brain. And here, let me read the final back cover copy on Space Clusters. Maybe we should have read this at the beginning, but the back cover copy says, and this is great because this is the person in the marketing department who had the enviable job of trying to sum up that whole story we just read in a marketing speak kind of way. So let's see what they do. I'm going to guess the back cover is sticking to the first half of the book here. He was the most famous, feared, and beloved rogue in the galaxy. She was a lieutenant in the Terran Interplanetary Corps. For 100 years, though she'd aged only 20, she'd been hot on his trail, determined to capture him, even if it meant turning the universe inside out, which is just what happened. All right, that's kind of what I thought. We're only using a metaphorical last line to refer to the second half of the book there. And I'm pretty sure that the marketing copy gets the math problem wrong from the beginning of the story, because they say for 100 years she'd aged only 20 and she was hot on his trail. Now, hold on here. We got to go back to that math problem, because now at the beginning, when they were explaining the suspendo state she'd been in, it said Lieutenant Cara Bursuto had pursued the rogue Ethan Dyack throughout the galaxy for 100 years. She'd been asleep in her ship's suspendo chamber for 80 years, yet has aged only 15. And on the back cover, it says she's aged only 20. What's going on here, DC marketing department? Did somebody not pay attention to that word problem there? Arthur Byron cover had a math problem and no one paid attention. We got it wrong on the back cover. Now, you see, this is the problem of putting a math problem in a story, is no one wants to do a math problem in a story, not even the marketing department. Or maybe the marketing department just thought it was dumb that it was 15 years. Maybe 20 years just felt snappier for the back cover. Who knows? But I think it's a measure of how confusing the story is that even the marketing person fucks up when they have to write 2 sentences about this comic. They don't know. They don't even know what to do. So yeah, this is a fascinatingly whacked out offering from the DC Comics brief science fiction graphic album line from the 80s. And it's been delightful to talk it out with you folks. I hope you've enjoyed it. And, I think the very last thing that I'd like to leave everyone with here in this episode, if you'll indulge me, is a few words from Alex Niño himself, because I think that's a good way to kind of bring it all home. So I'm going to go to the interview with Alex Niño from this comic book artist magazine. And we've got Niño talking here, and he says, okay, so he's talking about how he developed his style and why he developed his style the way he did. And so the interviewer, John Cook, says to him, a lot of the Filipino art seems to be similar, looking very much influenced by Nestor Redondo's style. Many artists clearly emulated his style, right? And Alex Niño says, that's right. Actually, it's a demanding style where they usually go for cute looking characters, but Nestor had a kind of style that fit perfectly. E.R. Cruz shares that kind of style, right? Niño says, correct. And so going on here, we talk to Niño and we ask him where he developed his style from. And Alex Niño says, hold on, we're going to find it here. Where did that go? It was here somewhere. Okay, so here's the Alex Niño part that I really wanted to talk about. So the interviewer, John Cook, is asking Niño about kind of where he fits in the lineage of Filipino artists who were coming over to America at that time. And he says, you're younger than most of the major Filipino artists, right? And Niño says, yes, I belong to the young warriors who ached to go head to head with the Nestor Redondos, Alfredo Alcalas, etc. We know it's a no-win situation, but we could always settle for leftovers. And the interviewer says, how did the American connection come about? And Alex says, through Tony de Zuniga. And they say, did you meet with Carmine Infantino and Joe Orlando when they flew over to the Philippines to come meet all the Filipino artists? And Alex Niño says, yes, they came to the Philippines to visit us, to see what was going on. Before that, I had sent Joe Orlando a whole bunch of samples. And then we go on to hear the interviewer say, when I was growing up, your work was really very appealing. I have 3 brothers, and my oldest, almost 10 years my senior, was very much into your work specifically, and we all shared an appreciation for your wild style, probably because it was such an original approach. You were much, much looser than any number of the other guys coming out of the Philippines, who were also wonderful, but yours was such a unique style, I couldn't see how you were related to those guys at all, to be honest. And Alex Niño answers, you know why? Because my work was all experimental. It was really very hard to compete and beat these guys. Every drawing seems to come easy to them, while I was so damn impatient and angry. I knew that it also took them years to reach the top. Well, I didn't care. So I had to do it in a different approach, make my own rules, even hitting below the belt. Whatever that means. There's always an excuse for being insane, but I got noticed because people realized there was a crazy guy under the hood. Right, you had this courage and you were obviously experimenting. Were drugs an influence at all? No, I drink alcohol, but I don't drink when I work. Well, I tried grass once, but it doesn't work. I get sick easily. No effect at all. Some of your work is downright hallucinogenic, Alex. That's why I ask. Yeah, it's a natural high. Doing monsters, out of this world scenes, inside of a panel is a window for you to get high. Who needs the other stuff? There's already a chemical in the brain to activate those mechanisms in your body that allow your mind to float into a joyous dream. And, I think that's a pretty terrific place to leave this. Alex Niño's work is such that it allows you to float into very much of a joyous dream and just exist in such fully wildly imagined and rendered worlds that it's unprecedented, the level of facility that this guy has as a comic book artist. And I just cannot recommend everyone diving into his work enough. He deserves all all the flowers, all the laurels, all the attention that the comic book community can lavish upon this man. He's truly a living legend, and he has not gotten his just due, I believe. And for God's sake, with all these artist editions being thrown at the comic book reading public, Scott Dunbier, where are you in your new venture? Please, could we see an Alex Niño artist edition of some fashion? That would be such an incredible gift to the comic book community. I would so love to see that, and I think that the world and Alex Niño deserves that kind of celebration of his work. Anyways, thank you all so much for being here with us, as always, on Comics Rot Your Brain, the show where we love to explore the more obscure and unheralded corners of the comic book world, particularly from the 1980s.